Yeah, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining today's webinar. So just to give a little context, so the impetus for this event was kind of to showcase some of the spirit and intentions behind an initiative we did as the UNDP Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific Strategic Foresight Network, and a related set of knowledge projects we did to help reimagine development in the region to be more locally driven, inclusive, and futures informed. And as the RBAP Foresight Network, we've been working with UNDP country offices to help build more anticipatory ways of thinking and working, and to bring more long-term thinking into our ways of understanding and managing risks and opportunities for development. So within this broader effort to support more future fit development planning and decision-making, we've also homed in on the important role that our knowledge sources play in this, and the ways we deem different forms of data as relevant to decision-making. So one element of this has been reimagining how we think of a knowledge product or the type of evidence that informs policy. And within this, the value of foresight research, or research that looks beyond evidence from the past, but helps us to examine some of the implications of potential changes on the horizon, and to consider the different possible futures that might emerge from signals of change that are visible in the present. And specifically, we engage subject experts to produce a set of foresight briefs that dive into several topics representing areas of significant uncertainty or possibilities to kind of transform some of the social paradigms as well as planetary realities of futures in Asia and the Pacific. So one of these related to the ways that our notion of rights might be evolving or need to evolve to respond to the challenges of our futures. Another was on the role of Indigenous wisdom in contributing to more sustainable development models. Another was on the global poly crisis and role for long-term thinking in policy mechanisms. And another asked whether digital public goods can help to deliver more equitable futures. So parallel to drawing on knowledge that comes from academic experts who can offer insights on some of these key trends and changes ahead and implications for decisions we make today, we also homed in on the role of imagination and lived experience as complementary and also equally vital sources of information for how we understand the emerging development landscape in Asian Pacific countries. So this is where the team developed a toolkit and piloted an approach in several countries, starting with civil society and youth in particular, called Inclusive Imaginaries, with the overarching goal of the imagination workshops that ensued being about building policies and programs to be more inclusive, more locally driven, and also reflective of the aspirations of the people they intend to serve. And the underlying premise of all this was a recognition that often the sources of knowledge we use to inform policy and our program priorities and approaches emerges from a small group of stakeholders, often those who have historically been in positions of power or considered experts as a result of their academic knowledge. And part of shaping flourishing, sustainable, equitable futures through our work is paying attention to whose voices inform that, and the investment put into the design of participatory processes to engage their creativity and power to lead change. And finally, as a thread across the insights and visions of flourishing futures that emerge from inclusive imaginaries, as well as the kind of provocations and signals of change we examined in the foresight briefs, we had this overriding question that pertained to how these different sources of knowledge can be in conversation with each other, and also how they can be seen and utilized as a complement to more traditional sources of hard data or quantitative data often used in decision-making. And we attempted to do this a little bit by publishing a synthesis report to weave together some of these insights from both initiatives, highlighting some of the implications for policy pathways and investments. So with all this as the backdrop, we're really excited today to have a panel discussion to elaborate on the spirit behind some of this work, specifically to help provoke some of our thinking around why and where there's a need to expand the knowledges that inform development processes, where imagination comes in and how this matters increasingly in the context of emerging risks, compounding inequities from the past, and new uncertainties in today's development landscape. And also critically, what it means to not just carry out, fun imagination exercises or provocative research on the side of our main work, but to actually integrate it into our core ways of thinking and working. So with that, I want to introduce our three speakers for today. So we have here Anasuya Sengupta, who is co-director and co-founder of Whose Knowledge, a global multilingual campaign to center the knowledges of marginalized communities online. She's led initiatives across the Global South and internationally for over 25 years to collectively create feminist presence and futures of love, justice, and liberation. We have Minji Song, who is a political affairs officer in the innovation cell of the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. And with the DPPA Innovation Cell, she explores new approaches and technologies for peace and security at the intersection of political analysis and policymaking, including what I hope we'll touch on a bit today, DPPA's work to incorporate futures thinking and speculative design into peace processes through one of their initiatives. And we have Heriberto Tapia, who's the Research and Strategic Partnership Advisor in the UNDP Human Development Report Office. He's been a member of the HDRO writing research team since 2014, working on the main flagship report and also expanding the office's capacity to produce different knowledge products. And for those who haven't read it yet, the 2021-2022 Human Development Report talks about some of this new uncertainty complex we face in the world today, also about the opportunities within some of these inflection points to reimagine our futures. And our discussion will be moderated by my colleague Arthi Krishnan, who is Senior Advisor on Foresight in the UNDP Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific. And just to note, so after the discussion, we'll open it up for Q&A at the end. So be thinking about your questions, putting them in the chat, or saving them for later when you can put your hand up. So with that, I pass it over to Arthi to kick us off.
Hi, colleagues. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. It's my deepest pleasure to be here today and with a wonderful group of panelists, of people I deeply admire in their work. So we're going to talk about imagination and what counts as knowledge fundamentally, which I think is such an integral part of how we conceive what truth is. And if we can't, and whether and how important or unimportant that is when we're thinking about the types of development futures ahead of us. So Heriberto, Minji, Anasuya, you do some amazing work. And just to jump straight into it, I'd love to ground us with the first question around where does our knowledge come from? What counts as knowledge? And what counts as evidence when we're thinking about development decisions and the implications of that? Maybe I could just open up to our panelists now. Anasuya, I would love to start with you, and then go to our other panelists.
Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I realize I'm sort of the outsider looking in to the UNDP world, and as a lapsed international development scholar myself, this is fun. It's fun to sort of be back in this space. So thank you very much, Sophia and Arthi, for inviting me. What is knowledge, I think, is one of the core questions of our time. When we are on this, I mean, honestly, we're on the edge of an abyss caused by a polycrisis, as some of your documents talk about it, interlocked, interconnecting crises. It's truly important for us as those who believe in ways of thinking about better presence and futures to ask whose knowledge is centered in the ways we think about these presents and futures. And one of the most important things I can say is that knowledge is always produced through power. What we think of as knowledge, what we perceive as knowledge, what we acknowledge and affirm as knowledge is produced through historical and ongoing structures of power and privilege. So for instance, when we think about, scholars from the Global South have said for many years now, why is it that only one particular version of the world is known as knowledge and the rest of us from the Global South, our work, our experience, our insights are seen as culture? What is the hierarchy between knowledge and culture? Why do we say knowledge in a particular context and culture in another context. And I'm actually going to call upon a dead white man to help me explain this a little bit. Very quickly, Michael Polanyi was a physical chemist from Hungary and Britain who talked about the fact that all embodied experience is knowledge. What we end up calling knowledge, though, is what is institutionalized formally through artifacts. So what we know tacitly in embodied form, through gesture, through voice, through oral means, when it is put into an artifact, whether it's a document, a textual document, audio tape, microfiche, video, that becomes an artifact because it gets institutionalized in a formal institution of knowledge, whether that's a university, archive, a museum, and so on. And then the question is, whose institutions are these, and how does this then explain to us what knowledge is? So for us at Whose Knowledge, I will just say that we think about people as knowledge, and that's our radical notion of the way we think about it. We center those who are most marginalized historically in the world, which means the majority of the world, just as a reminder to all of us who already know this, but this is the minoritized majority of the world. And for us, knowledge is both embodied experience and formal institutional knowledge, but particularly centering those whose knowledges have been marginalized across the world in multiple ways, including and especially the Asia Pacific. So I'll stop there and can explain more as we talk more.
Thank you. You know, the point around where some groups' knowledge is construed as culture and some groups as knowledge. I never actually thought about it in that way, but yes, yes, I can absolutely see that, and you're right. Minji, I want to come to you because the work that DPPA Innovation Cell have been doing in terms of the speculative futures work and trying to bring imagination into the space to prompt delicate dialogue, I think, is super interesting in this. So I'd love to come to you to sort of maybe pick up on this point around, what is construed as knowledge and how and why DPPA have pursued the sort of speculative approach to these dialogues, to difficult dialogues, I should say, to try and push the boundaries a little bit. So Minji, maybe over to you.
Great. Thank you, Aarti, and thank you for allowing me to follow Anasuya, because I think it's always great to hear from an external kind of local peace builder. I want to call peace builder rather than within internally working in a very bureaucratic structure. So I was actually thinking to that question of what is knowledge, and I can talk a little bit more about why we're using kind of these design processes such as experiential foresight, like speculative design. But for us, when we are dealing with these sensitive matters where security considerations or political discussions are not available for certain communities because of the power relations, or because, for example, in Northeast Asia, where I have a project, you don't have the actual spaces between the ministries of foreign affairs where there is a sub-regional dialogue on peace. So how is it that we can expand this space? And so we wanted to create a little bit more of a creative opportunity for different actors. But I think the main gist and between us, and I know this is recorded, but the main kind of approval that we got for this new approach, this participatory approach of implying futures, is because we identified there is a data gap. So why is there a data gap? Because there's a data gap that we don't have of the youth in the region. So how can we as policymakers fill that gap? And so we identified the safe space of using foresight. So another kind of, I think another inspiration that I had to your question, Aarti, and also to Anasuya's intervention is there is the importance of what is knowledge. But for us policymakers, especially working in the UN system, I think how is knowledge used? How is knowledge actually applied is actually very, very interesting. So it's to do with the culture, the institutional culture, I'm on mission right now, and my colleagues have actually shown me one example where there is a code cable, which I don't know if many of you know, but in the peace and security kind of realm, many of the missions use code cables to communicate with HQ. And in a code cable report, they were denied to attach a graph. So for example, when you have a code cable, when you are doing an analytical update, you are not allowed to attach a graph. So that is an example of the institutional culture that we are working with. And I think whose knowledge is—
Stop there, Minji.
Yes.
Why? Why?
Because it's not part of the culture, Arti. Because it's not allowed. Because it's not allowed. And we can go into the details of code cables and how this arose. What it actually, but we don't, this is not the space for that.
Okay.
So, you know, how is the knowledge shared? How is it shared? How is it ingested? And how is it applied by decision makers? I think is very, very interesting. And are we seeing a movement towards this kind of more inclusive knowledge gathered through imaginative means to be taken more seriously? And that's something that I'm quite interested in. So I'll stop here.
I love what you said about how it's ingested, and then how it is conveyed. You know, I don't think I've actually heard it phrased in that way before, but that's so true. Heriberto, I want to come to you. This, you know, the Human Development Report always pushes the boundaries of how we conceive development, and it often, you know, and what I love about the work of HDR, of the HDRO, is it tries very, very hard to bring us back to the philosophies of development, but not, you know, not accepting that those philosophies remain true all the time, but pushing the boundaries of that. And of course, the recent HDR talked a lot about, you know, the need for imagination in very different times. So, you know, we've had sort of two quite strong provocations here, where Anasuya pushes very rightly that, you know, some forms of knowledge is knowledge, some is culture. Minji's pushing that how we ingest it is something that's really important. Yeah, I'd love your reactions to this, you know, particularly sitting where you sit and doing the work that you do.
Thank you, Radi. Thank you, colleagues. I would start actually by reflecting about what has been our own approach over time. Because even us, I mean, as an office, somehow we have been restricting the space of attention and what we consider knowledge. And let me explain you to this point. So if you think about our main index, the Human Development Index, is an index that defines development. It's a proxy, we know it's imperfect, but defines development looking at three components: education, health, standard of living, and the benchmark are the ones of the most developed countries. So it's like it's a journey from being developing to be developed. So somehow the framing of that is going from point A to point B. So, and this came up in 1990. I think it was a big contribution, going beyond income. It was even simpler, but somehow it was part of this mindset at that time that also coincided with these ideas of the end of history, also coincided with these ideas of Washington Consensus, also decided with the boom of the idea that we had to all converge. So it was it was generated in a moment where somehow imagination was being suppressed, because what we have to do is go from point A to point B. So, and now we are in a very different context. So certainly the way we imagine human development is different. We need to account for instance, for planetary pressures. And we have been saying, you know, there is no country that has been able to resolve these puzzles of being able to generate very high levels of human development and at the same time low planetary pressures. So the fact that there is no country there means that we need to imagine how to get there. We don't know exactly how. At the same time, we have different layers of uncertainty. Democracy that before was improving in most countries, now we see there are problems, there is increasing polarization. And in a nutshell, I think people feel very unsettled, and this is what our last report is saying. And in part, people are unsettled because they don't understand what is going on. I think that forces us to try to find answers. And what we are proposing is precisely to transition towards a broader understanding of things. Well, culture becomes central. And the way we are framing this is to say, well, in a situation where everything is stable, in a situation where we need to go from point A to point B, in a way, it's fine methodologically to assume that everything else is constant, right? The ceteris paribus assumption for that is very standard in economics and policy making. But when there are so many things that are moving at the same time, it's a methodological imperative to look at what can happen if we also change the full context. And in that sense, we are trying to push very hard to opening different ways of looking at what we are doing in terms of social norms and in terms of culture, in terms of values, because otherwise it would be impossible to make sense of today's world. So we can iterate further, but that's just to introduce the topic.
Roberto, I love that. You know, we often, I think in private talk about this idea, and I saw Anastasia nodding, so I'm going to go to her. And I know this is a favorite topic for her, but this idea of moving from point A to point B, this idea of at one point we're underdeveloped and then one point we reach development. And it's like this thing. And we don't, I think, put in, you know, within the institutions that we sit in, push enough, and which is why I loved the HDR report this year, because it was saying, well, these paradigms that we were working under in the past are not fit for this unsettled futures we're moving into. So Anastasia, I want to come back to you on this point, because I'd love to hear from you sort of this paradigm of, you know, moving from point A to point B and understanding how that impacts what we think is developed.
I'm so enjoying this conversation already. So thank you, Minji and Heriberto. And thank you for both your provocations. I think there's something deeply problematic, as you pointed out, Heriberto, around linear versions of the world, when we know that linearity has not linearly got us to any form of progress or development. And therefore, I really respect the questioning of what we think of as development, why it is that we are on this, have been on this hierarchy of, you know, least developed to most developed, and the switching. And I think the HDR does this really well and has over the past few years, to a much more complex, nuanced and contextual notion of well-being, for instance. For us, we think about justice. And the reason we think about justice is because for us, it's deeply important to understand justice and well-being as being centered in the experiences and imaginations of those who have been most marginalized. So what happens when, and I'm going to use an example from the Pacific Islands, right? Here we are, we think about the oceans as being one of the ways in which we can truly think about some way out of the planetary collapse that we have caused as humans. And yet we are so poor at understanding the richness of Pacific Islander knowledge and expertise. And this is where I want to just push back a little on the different notions of culture. So one is culture, as you're talking about it, Heriberto, which is how we relate to each other. But the other form of culture that I was bringing up was, I think, to the way that Minji was talking about it, which is culture as knowledge, culture as the way we practice knowledge with each other, right? And we share knowledge. And that hierarchy again of those who are cultural, right? Indigenous people, Dalit Bahujan folks, minoritized folks in different ways. I want to push back on seeing them as cultural communities and more as knowledge communities. And recognizing that we are in a moment in which we have to look at intersecting and multiple forms of knowledge systems. And many of us in this room, I think, embody multiple knowledge systems ourselves. How do we use that as a way forward? Or again, not to use the word forward, but how is that a way to reimagine the just societies, the just worlds that we want? So thank you. I'm really enjoying this conversation.
Thank you. Let me come to you because there's, I'm fascinated about the work, the speculative work that you are doing. And I want to ask if our processes for collective imagining, the ways of thinking about futures, how have you considered that your approaches to it to be more power aware? And do you use these approaches as a way to pay attention to the types of inequities that we don't want to bring into the future? And, again, how you do it in this very sort of political space that you operate in. Would love to hear how you sort of manage those tensions playing out.
Great. I should start by saying, whenever we are asked in terms of impact, how has it changed anything? I'm always very hesitant to kind of talk about it. I mean, working on innovation, it's incredibly difficult to measure any sort of progress, any sort of change. But hopefully this kind of new way of thinking, that's the whole point, new way of thinking, introducing innovative ways and introducing new ways of doing things, as the SG has said, that is hopefully going to contribute to the institutional change. And that was the kind of premise that we went in with the sci-fi, the speculative world building. So two of our projects actually have the more experiential foresight elements. The Northeast Asia Youth Project, where we actually collaborated with a foresight design school and participated with students in world building, taking senses that have been, so sense making, horizon scanning, taken from the trained youth peace builders. So it was a whole process in terms of whether we actually applied the findings of these world buildings. And an example that I can give you is one kind of built new speculative world in 2060 is, and recalling that this is on sub-regional peace, this kind of formulation of new ceremonies that are not wedding ceremonies between a couple, but ceremonies between a family. So the question was, who would be left out? So as you know, with world building exercises, and when you have an artifact from the future, it inspires you to question what are the systems that are enabling this? What are we okay with that system being developed? What are the kind of consequences of that system, and how do our kind of current thinking right now in terms of the way that the system is working, how is that going to prevent it, or how is that going to contribute to it? So this kind of particular design that they developed kind of made you think, and when we shared it with policymakers in the region, they were very excited about it. They said, oh, it's a very exciting piece. It makes me think about the people who are going to be left out, the future of care, the kind of the services that are going to be provided, et cetera, et cetera. But what happens to that afterwards? So yes, we have that moment of an out-of-the-box kind of thinking exercise with the speculative sci-fi pieces that we have developed, which looks at the future of peacemaking and collaborating with a sci-fi illustrator and doing world building very much focused on technology because that is the history of sci-fi, and looking at how new technologies in the future can impact our work in peacemaking. So we have used this in kind of exercises where we're doing an icebreaker exercise, like, so let's get a bunch of senior decision makers in a room and let's ask them what they think about this piece. So I think, yes, it's a great opportunity to kind of push the envelope, to kind of say this is what is out there. The fact that we are basing these kind of design principles from ministries of defense or kind of private sector actors, I think that helps. But whether DPPA is ready to use that for kind of decision making is another question. So again, I think this is part of a longer conversation, but I would be very curious to hear any insights from colleagues in this panel and also colleagues in the room, whether they have seen kind of policy impacts. And I think that is related to how that kind of knowledge is ingested by the existing policy structures. It's not a matter of let's give the agency for policymaking completely to these groups, to these participants, but I was talking about how the kind of the way that we managed to get the approval for the project was to say that we have a knowledge gap. We have a knowledge gap to a policy issue that we have identified. So is there a need that we completely change that paradigm and we completely say it's not the policy gap for us, but it's a policy gap for you? So there's I hope I haven't been rambling on and not really answered your question.
No, I think that's so good. I mean, like I, as you know, love speculative design, and I've done it, used it extensively in previous jobs, but haven't done it at UNDP because I can't work out how to inject it into a process. And our imagination work with our 5-country offices was so fascinating, and it is what was interesting is when we published the report, we got a lot of wonderful feedback, and it was grounded in this one common theme that this had a lot of heart, and which I thought was interesting and wonderful to hear. But I'm like, oh, why is it grounded in heart? Like, why is it not rigor or something like that? It was just, it's our own mental models, that sometimes need to be challenged. Heriberto, I want to come to you, even though I'm trying to not, follow the path here, but please, everybody, just jump in. How, the HDR talked about the need for imagination. And, coming back to Minji's point, they've done these massive processes and produced and got different ideas and visions and tensions that they've unearthed. And some of those questions were so deeply, interrogative and much needed, but then not necessarily, as she using her words, ingested back by policymakers. So, from your perspective, what do we, as these UN structures, need to do to accept these different sources of knowledge as truth and equally valid in our policy making, in our policy decision making?
Yeah. So let me first make one point about the context. So why we need to, one of the reasons why we need to open our view and to accept these different sources now, in part because, let me come back to this idea of unsettledness. We are facing a problem now that societies are increasingly divided. And one of the things that we are trying to explore is, so in this moment, when we should come together to resolve the problems that we're facing that are common, we appear more divided. And our research shows that this has a lot to do with this lack of understanding of what is happening, because somehow there are promises that haven't been fulfilled, because all of these things basically were generated in this kind of more static world. We are going from point A on point B, so you have more education, you should expect something better. those things are not happening. And therefore, we need to be able to make sense of the current situation. And in this context is when we see that we are forced to open the space to make sense of the world. We have been suppressing the imagination of, in general, because in this logic of going from point A to point B, but also we have been suppressing the participation of many different groups. And here I would like to come back to the point of Anasuya, that we look at culture in a very broad way. So there isn't a contradiction because we emphasize that it might be different cultural repertoires, different responses, that different things that have been in a way solved by certain groups, finding the balance that we as a whole have lost. And therefore, we should be open to learn from those things and to pay attention to those things. Just let me, we have documented how, for instance, indigenous groups, in the Amazon, the per capita carbon capture in the Amazon by indigenous groups is equivalent to the average emission of the top 1% per capita, average emission of the top % of the population. So in a way, it's really powerful. It's a source of a big solution. But what we are doing in those areas, we are not promoting that. On the contrary, many of these indigenous groups are being marginalized. Their very basic human rights are not being respected. So they are contributing to the whole planet, not because we are promoting it. They are doing it despite the fact that we are cornering them. So I think we really need to start paying attention on all of these realities and enhance the participation of people from different perspectives, because unless we are open to new sources of knowledge, I think it's going to be very difficult to find good answers to the problems that we are facing today, and a good understanding that will allow us to then come together to solve the problems.
That is so true, Roberto. And I often, one of the reasons we published the brief on Indigenous futures was, we often see when we talk about Indigenous groups that their role, how we conceive of the importance of these communities seems to just be blanketed around how they care for the planet, their efforts in sustainability, environmental sustainability, but rather Indigenous protocols that go back for millennia around how communities relate to each other, how they talk about power imbalances, how they make decisions, which are so close to the philosophies, that development economists talked about at the very start. We don't consider those protocols, but rather we talk about, their efforts in maintaining the planet. So you're so right in how we marginalize that knowledge and put upon them a sort of role that only speaks to a portion of what we can learn from them. Reactions from Anasuya and Minji. Did you see this play out? Because I know you, Minji, you were working with, very sort of different groups in the work that you do. And how do you see this play out?
I think from the side of the UN, it's always a question of, so the power angle, I think it's incredibly important. And I don't think one workshop gathering diverse communities together and giving them a safe space for conversation is going to change anything. Another kind of question, and it kind of relates back to that question of why should communities be feeding their insights to our policy agendas? Why isn't there multiple policy agendas that we can all agree that have the same importance? And another thought was, okay, I've lost that other thought, but I think that was really, it's provocative. So when we as a UN are engaging with perhaps different actors and elected officials or political actors or representatives, a question that we always have is it the role of the UN to engage with them? Or is it the role of the UN to build capacities of partners, to build capacities of CSOs, for CSOs to be better representative and more widely representative of different communities? And so that's always a question. So whenever we do these kind of more imaginative, reaching out to different communities, reaching out to different peace builders or groups, the solution that we have at the end is hopefully sustainability and empowerment. It's not that we're always going to continue relying on the same network, which has a different kind of power dynamic. So I kind of wanted to end on that reflection.
Anasuya, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I want to come back to the question that Minji asked earlier, which I think she just came back to beautifully herself, which is who is left behind, and push it further to say who is left behind and why, and where are they left behind? So, you know, to push it, we often ask the question, who is in the room and who is not in the room? But then we don't ask the question that goes further. Why are they in the room? Why are they not in the room? How do they act when they are in the room? How are they enabled and empowered to act when they are in the room? And so I want to push us all on the difference between participation, which we use very easily now. At least we've got to the speaking sort of somewhat half jokingly, the linear stage of getting to participation. But I think the key is leadership. What happens when we move from participation to true and meaningful leadership? And by that, I want to come back to Minji's point around whose agenda is this? How are we going to move from what has historically been a colonial capitalist system of knowledge production, not just way of living? We've come to this crisis through these histories. And even us as people who believe in better presents and futures, if we are going to continue to be instrumentalist and extractive, exactly as you were saying, Aarti, are we any better? In some ways, we could be worse because we are seen as being people who have good intentions. We're not profit-seeking. And yet, if we are to behave as though we are being instrumentalist and extractive about knowledge and imagination, in some ways, the betrayal is far greater. So what does it mean to center leadership then? And recognizing that power is contextual. I mean, I am often in conversations around tech in Silicon Valley, where I'm one of the few women, one of the few people of color, one of the few people with a Global South passport. However, in India, I have Savarna privilege, I have English-speaking privilege, I have city living privilege. That is a very different relational privilege. And I have to own my caste privilege, I have to own my class privilege, and recognize that these are different in different contexts. And so my participation or leadership in one context is different from my participation and leadership in another. And so what does it mean if we were to move to the notion of leadership and therefore design from those who have been minoritized all this while and who continue to be minoritized rather than being extractive ourselves?
I love that, Anasuya. I mean, and a lot of us code switch, right? Based on where the communities we come from, the communities we currently are present. And, Anasuya, you and I have talked about this a lot when we talk about different, I guess, diversity measures. We never talk about caste and we never talk about class. And they're such inherent, and, those of us that exhibit or come from caste, different, come from that sort of communities understand it, but it's not something we talk about. I'm conscious about time, and this conversation is so rich. And there are a couple of comments in the chat. Terence Hayeti talks about the UNDP Jeff Small Grants Program. We've supported thousands of small grants led by Indigenous peoples in support of their traditional knowledge territories and biocultural products. That's great. There's a link there to that work. There's another question there from Thiruwood, but before going to Thiruwood's question, I kind of want to shift this conversation a little bit. And I want to talk about hope and joy. The question really is, it's a bit broad, but what is the cost of only having like a harm or problem focused lens to the work we do, i.e. leaving out desire, joy, hope, in terms of even our imagination processes, our knowledge processes, etc. We often have a problem focused rather than a joy focused. I'm just curious about your perspectives on that. Anybody feel free to jump in.
So it's a very difficult question, because when you have so many problems, those take the agenda, and it gives a sense of urgency, and precisely right now we are seeing that. But it's very important that we don't forget that, because again, coming back to this idea of making sense of the world, we cannot make sense of the world if we only are caring about the urgency of trying to avoid bad things. That can take us to a bad place, right? If we just try to protect ourselves from the current crisis, there could be a tendency to isolation, protectionism, and without looking at the benefit of being part of a whole, where we can gain from being part of a community and valuing that. So it's something that is beyond what we can quantify today, but it's something that we should acknowledge as part of our understanding what's the meaning of humanity. So I think that part is central to be able to, precisely through imagination, even if we cannot quantify it very clearly today, to be able to picture it, and as a clear guidance that we are doing this in part because we believe in that there is a space of commonality that is good for everyone. So, and I think there are also some practical examples, right, that can give us a way of quantifying certain things. Let me give you one. In a moment of crisis, historians tell us that other cultures, the way they overcame some crisis was through migration. It's an adaptive mechanism. So the mindset to migration should be a positive one. We are going to be better off if we manage this very well. But now, when we talk about migration, in many cases, we look at it through a negative lens. So we need to be able to make the switch, and with imagination, trying to precisely seeing the benefit of it, I think we can turn things around.
That is so true. And I reflect that, I'm reflecting on it even in my own practice, because even, within UNDP, our foresight, our anticipatory work is very grounded in risk and uncertainty, and less on hope and joy, and I say, yeah, you're right. The betrayal is greater. Minji, thoughts on that, particularly for a peace process?
Yeah, I was actually just writing in the chat because I think that's a fascinating question. And I was just going to reflect that it's a reflection of the system that we live in now. In, as you mentioned, political processes, if you think about election processes, fear motivates voters more than hope. If you look at the narrative that is used in media, fear sells, clickbait. So that's the system that we live in. And if we are looking more towards hope, And there have been some kind of reconciliations that I have supported in my work. And a lot of the kind of the polarizing themes kind of disappear when you talk about the future of a country or you talk about hope. So it's how you really harness it. But I completely agree that looking at fear and the kind of the potential risks for anything is what motivates the system that we live in right now.
Yeah. There is a question here from Aisha that I want to bring in because it's similar to a question that was posed earlier as well. And Aisha, I hope you don't mind, I just want to put a bit of context on the work, the project that you're working on. So what Aisha says, we are initiating a project on, so Aisha's from our country office in Indonesia. And in that country office, they are initiating a project on collective imagination with local indigenous communities as a way to capture local trajectories versus a national development agenda. And she was asking if the panel could provide some pragmatic tips on safeguarding these processes to ensure that insights do translate to representative policy planning processes. I guess what we mean is, so that it's not seen as just, oh, yes, we had the consultations, but what are some tips that could help in the work that she's doing at the moment with Indigenous communities to ensure that it's safeguarded and not just seen as, oh, this was just a consultation and a tick the box.
I can start, though I would love to hear what Heriberto and Minji have to offer on that. And thank you for the question, Aisha. I mean, one thing, I'm going to say three things because there's so much to say, but I'll say three things. One is to remember that Indigenous communities are not a monolith. There are over 6,000 Indigenous nations in the world. So each of them are complex, and they are not, all communities are not monoliths either. They are, with all their extraordinary histories of wisdom and knowledge, they are also internally racked with issues of patriarchy and power and, control of different kinds. And I think from our point of view, as we have done some of this work with the communities we serve, there's one practical and political piece that I will say, and then a broader one. One is that we always try and work with and in the languages of the communities we work with. And again, language is a proxy for knowledge. There are over 7,000, nearly 8,000 spoken and signed languages in the world. The fact that we continue to use English or Eurolingual colonial languages or dominant languages as our primary modus operandus is, I think, itself an issue. None of us can be the fullest of ourselves in another language. I mean, my English brain starts shutting down mid-afternoon. And so what does it mean to do that? So for instance, we work with in a circle of Indigenous feminist leaders from 3 different parts of the world: the Pacific Islands, the Great Basin area of Turtle Island or the US, and the Brazilian Amazon. And as we do that with simultaneous interpretation, recognizing that even their Portuguese, for instance, Brazilian Portuguese is their second language, not their first. But even that is much more comfortable and much more powerful than expecting them to speak in English. So even in the Indonesian space, Aisha, what would it mean to work not just in English and Bahasa, but in the languages of the communities you work with? So that's one aspect of it. And then the bigger political piece, though it's related, is what is your social contract around what happens with this process, right? And it's coming back to something that Minji said. What is the expectation that we are engendering, and how are you going to fulfill that expectation? And in our case, we talk about that social contract collectively. What is it that the communities expect from us? What is it that we are expecting? How is this a collection of complementary embodied expertises, multiple expertises of different kinds, right? It's not an us and them. What does it mean to be UNDP staff in partnership with these communities in a true and meaningful way. And your social contract is far more important. How you fulfill that social contract is far more important than necessarily the other way around. And recognizing that power dynamic and that responsibility dynamic, I think, is really important.
Thank you.
If I can come in here and just add some points, I think I completely agree with everything that Anastasia said. Just in terms of the programmatic, when you are thinking about that social contract, make sure that you're remunerating them for their time. Make sure that you are empowering them. This is not an exploitative process. You as a program manager should be the first one to make sure of that, because there are going to be opportunities where policymakers or further along the line are going to treat this as an exploitative manner. So I think that is really critical in treating them as consultants as you would in another dialogue setting with perhaps experts, making sure that there is some sort of sustainability at the end, whether it's networks, whether it's skills, whether it's kind of creating the policy spaces for them to lead. I think there's so many kind of suggestions that I would have to kind of change that power dynamic.
Amazing. Okay, we have 3 minutes left. Are there any questions from our audience that you'd like to chime in now for our panelists? And yes, Terence, UNDP has its own institutional culture. Could the Foresight team invite an external institutional ethnography to review our own practices, building on the Ford Foundation guidelines? Yeah, absolutely. I think that's super interesting. I know the SDG integration team is looking at that very closely, but yes, thanks so much for the suggestion. That's a great one. I'd love to, perhaps, if there are no questions from the audience anymore, maybe some final thoughts from our panelists, so we can bring this wonderful conversation and dialogue to a close. Heriberto, maybe we can start with you.
Thank you, Galix, for the excellent conversation. Yeah, I think one final thought could be the importance of being able to all contribute to blend knowledge. So to be very honest about where we are coming from, try to put on the table the things that we think are important. So for instance, from our side, we are investing a lot on a new generation of data with forecast that will give a sense of, for instance, what are going to be the effects of climate change in different parts of the world, very geolocalized. But it would be great to see how people make sense of this data, whether they find it important to them or not, or maybe we are not measuring the right variables for them. And so I think to have this dialogue, so it's so important. And coming back to the project, the question about the project, yeah, it's good to have this contrast of, they say, well, this your objective is this. We don't think that is actually important to us. And so I think I would invest on and double down on that dialogue and to be able to see the difference, but also the things that are binding us together in terms of common objectives.
Thank you so much, Heriberto. I love that. Maybe Minji, over to you for some final words, and then to Anastasia.
Thank you for inviting me, inviting us, the Innovation Cell, to this conversation. It was so fascinating. I learned a lot, and I think this kind of conversation where we do share not only the successes and the developments, but really the challenges, the failures. I was very taken by Heriberto talking about the kind of the linear trajectory of development and how kind of a reflection exercise is very much needed, and Asuya about how the potential risk of kind of us appearing to be more exploitative when the intention is not there. That kind of, I think, failure and the the reflection is so critical to share. So I hope there are more opportunities to kind of share this and more opportunities such as this. And UNDP colleagues, you're doing great work, Arati and team, on the foresight brief developments, and we're very much sharing it along the chain. So well done. Over.
Thank you, Minji. And Anasuya, final words from you.
Well, I will say I'm personally feeling hope to be in a conversation like this at UNDP. 20 years ago, when I sort of began these conversations as a young development scholar, these were not the conversations we were having, and not the conversations I was in the margins of. So even that, I know that sounds linear and from point A to point B, Heriberto, but I do want to say that I really appreciate that we're having conversations we haven't had before, and that we have the courage to do that. I'll just say that, going back to the joy and imagination piece that you said, Ayati, one thing to remember is that joy, hope, and imagination have been the resilience infrastructures of our communities always. The most oppressed and marginalized of our communities could not be doing what they do day in and day out, being who they are day in and day out, being resilient without joy, hope, and imagination. So this is not new to them. They live with multiple complex versions of extremely difficult lives, and with their own practices of joy and hope. And so I think, again, to recognize that the imaginations of those who brought us here are not the imaginations that are going to get us out of here. And I think the hope that we need to express are the hopes of those for whom hope is a discipline, as Mariam Keba says so beautifully. So that's where I sit, with hope as a discipline and joy as a practice.
I love that. Hope as a discipline and joy as a practice. Heriberto, Anasuya, Minji, thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for the generosity. Thank you for leaning into these conversations and for the bravery in pushing a different agenda in all your work. I'm such an admirer of all of you and the work that you're doing. Minji saying we promote all your NHDR, and Anasuya, we promote all of this, because together we're stronger. So to echo Anasuya's words, joy as a practice, hope as a discipline. Colleagues, thank you so much for joining us this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever in the world that you are. I hope this has put a smile on your face. Thank you, Minji, Heriberto, and Anasuya, for such wisdom. And we hope this is the start of many more of these dialogues for us as we shift our own mental models and parameters of what is possible. Please keep an eye out for all our future updates for this from the Strategic Foresight Network team. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.